Good evening. Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for the program this evening. My name is Kara Neely, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The SAB is a bipartisan group. As a member of the SAB, I get access to many great opportunities by being involved with the Institute. If you are a KU student and are interested in joining, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. For this evening's event, if you'd like to know more about our guest, the event itself, upcoming Institute events, and more, you can download a printable program handout. The link is in the event description below. At the end of this evening's event, we'll have time for you to ask questions of our guest. Please email your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. And now, please join me in welcoming Director of the Institute, Bill Lacey.
Kara, thank you very much. Appreciate your doing our student vote tonight with us. I want to thank everyone for joining us for what is going to be a very entertaining and tonight. Our co-sponsors for tonight include the KU Department of History, the KU Department of Political Science, and the KU School of Journalism. We're delighted to welcome two wonderful guests tonight. Our guests are Claire Bond Potter, Professor of History for Social Research in New York, Danforth Professor of History at Oberlin College in Ohio. Together, Professors Potter and Romano have co-edited a book entitled Historians on Hamilton, How a Blockbuster Restaging America's Past. Please welcome Professors Romano and Potter. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's great to have you both. One of the things I like to do with the guest is I like our audience to know a little bit more about you. So I'm going to ask each of you to speak a couple minutes to your upbringing and education.
Okay, I'll go first. So I'm a Midwesterner. Was born in Ohio, and I'm now back in Ohio. But so I was born in a working class town outside of Cleveland, a suburb of Cleveland, and I'd say my actual path towards becoming a historian started when I was really little. I lived in a community that was an all-white suburb, and when I was 7, a black family moved in, and someone burned a cross on their lawn. And soon after that, my family moved to another community that was only about 45 minutes away, but was racially integrated and just much more diverse. And so when I went off to college, I realized I was taking classes that would allow me to answer the question, how did these towns get to be so different? Why is somebody burning a cross on a family's lawn in the mid-70s in Ohio, right? How do I understand these things? That was my college career, and that led me to, I went out to grad school at Stanford, where I studied American history, particularly with a focus on histories of race and African-American history. And then went from there to Wesleyan University, where I met Claire and taught for many years before coming back to Ohio and coming to teach at Oberlin.
Yeah, and like Renee, I came to history as a child. I was born outside of Philadelphia in a suburb, and my father was an amateur history buff, and he used to like to take us on the weekends to all of the American Revolutionary sites that are around Philadelphia. So we used to go and visit Valley Forge, and we would visit a house called Cherry Hill, which is where George Washington stayed for a while when he was president. And I got very involved with being in the same place as all these great historical events. But weirdly, when I went off to Yale, I decided to be an English major. And if there are lots of students in the audience, let me just tell you, being an English major is great preparation for being a historian, because what historians do is they tell stories about the past that are persuasive. And we'll talk about that a little bit tonight with Hamilton, because what Hamilton is a story about the past. I just want to throw in something else about my background, which is I also partly grew up in the summers. I would spend 3 months with my grandparents in southern Idaho. And one of the things that did for me is to allow me to experience two very different worlds. The world of the East Coast and elite institutions, and then the world of farming. My grandparents lived in a farm town. So all of my friends were the kids of farmers. And so I consider myself very, very lucky to have experienced a broad swath of what America was before I went to graduate school in history at NYU. As Renee said, she and I met at Wesleyan University. It was a wonderful place to teach. Renee and I taught together. We invented courses together. And then Renee left me. And so
Sorry.
I couldn't stay at Wesleyan any longer. And I went to the New
Right.
School of Political Research in New York City, which is where I teach today. Which is, of course, New York is where Hamilton happened.
Yes,
Back to you, Bill.
absolutely. So, Professor, what is Lin trying to achieve with Hamilton?
Well,
Renee,
take
why
that
don't
one,
you
Claire.
start, and then you pitch in.
Okay.
So
All right.
what
I'll
Lin
start
Manuel
then.
Miranda, you go ahead.
Right. Okay. So I'll start. Okay. I'll just start, but with the slight little story that always irks us, that Lin Manuel Miranda was a student at Wesleyan when Claire and I were both teaching there and teaching all these history classes, and he didn't take any of them. Right. So we could have met Lin at Wesleyan theoretically. I think it is my daughter's greatest, my greatest failing as a parent in her eyes is that I did not meet Lin Manuel Miranda when he was a student at Wesleyan. So he. We wish we had his own insight into that in terms of actually we being able to pick up the phone and call him. But I think what he was trying to do with Hamilton is, one, tell a really compelling story, right? He got really into this biography by Ron Chernow, and he found this character that he could personally relate to, someone who he saw had made himself, someone who he saw was a writer and who made himself by writing and crafted a world with words, and someone who was ambitious and, in his perspective, an immigrant who was coming into this country and succeeding. And so he had a personal connection to the story. And I think his decision to do the color conscious casting, right, to actually say, we're going to have all of the characters in this play that would normally be, that are historically white figures, right? George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all of them played by actors of color, was also a very clear move on his part to try to make a case about the ownership and the right of everyone in the country to tell its story, the importance of, in a diverse America, everyone feeling a sense of belonging and the capacity of owning the nation, as it were. And so I think through Hamilton, he was both telling a story that was compelling personally, a biographical character tale, and also making a political argument.
Yeah, and just to pick it up from there, I think one of the important ways to situate Hamilton is that it was written during the Bush administration and produced during the Obama administration. And what we're seeing in that period of time is the beginnings of what today we sort of identify as political polarization. And I think one of the things Miranda was trying to do was show that politics had always been an argument. There's lots of arguing in Hamilton, and people aren't arguing the person. They're not attacking each other for no reason, although there are moments in which there are these rap battles. But what they're doing is they're arguing about ideas. And I think one of the things Miranda wanted to put back in the vernacular was the notion that there were competing ideas during the American Revolution. There were competing ideas during the early national period, and people came to conclusions. And at the end of the play, Thomas Jefferson, who is Hamilton's greatest enemy, except for Burr, Thomas Jefferson admits that what Hamilton did was good. So I think there was a lesson in the play about what politics could be if we actually went back to basics and argued ideas rather than tried to defeat each other all the time.
Okay, I have to admit, I unfortunately lost the feed during your responses. So if you've already answered the next question, I apologize in advance. Of all the founding fathers, why did Miranda select Hamilton?
So, he found Ron Chernow's book, right? He's on vacation. He's been writing in the Heights. He's really burned out. He's tired. He goes on vacation. He takes Ron Chernow's book to read for fun, which, a lot of people do, right? They go to airports, and what do they see on the bookshelves at the airport? They see founding father books, right? They see these kinds of literature that one of our authors in the collection calls founding fathers chic, right? And I think what he saw in Hamilton, why Hamilton, one, his story he thought was undertold, right? We'd had a John Adams miniseries. There's been lots and lots about Washington. There's been lots about Jefferson, but Hamilton he thought was a figure who was not as well known. He saw in him someone who really had these incredible ideas, was incredibly important at the founding of the nation, was incredibly important in shaping the first national economy, in being George Washington's right-hand man, as he says during the Revolution, like all of these things that were really historically important that hadn't gotten his due. But I think like Hamilton is just such an interesting figure, right? I mean, Hamilton is a man who was destroyed by his own ambition, right? He's a classic tragedy, right? Somebody who was very ambitious, had a brilliant mind, but was ruthless and also was just too ambitious for his own good, right? And ended up dying in a duel, right? So as a storyteller, I think Lin Manuel Miranda saw in Hamilton an incredible story and just a human drama that was really worthy of his attention.
Yeah, I think what Renee says is absolutely right. I would add another piece of it, which is Lin Manuel Miranda is a New Yorker, first, last, and full stop.
Yeah.
And Hamilton was a New Yorker. And by making the musical about Hamilton, Miranda could put New York right in the center of the revolution. And that's really interesting because the story of the revolution is usually a story about Boston, maybe Philadelphia, certainly Virginia, but it's very, very rare that anybody focuses on New York's role in the revolution, even though it was actually crucial for all kinds of reasons. So Miranda's work up until that point was a musical called In the Heights, which was a kind of love letter to his neighborhood in New York. I think really Hamilton extends that love letter to the history of the entire city. I also want to add, Hamilton is definitely the center of this musical. I happen to be a huge Aaron Burr fan. And I really think Burr is the most complex character in the musical. And so if you listen to it over and over again, and certainly if you see it, the way Burr commands the stage, and you can see it now on Disney streaming, I think having it in New York allows Burr to really be fully expressed as a character in a way that he wouldn't be. And so Hamilton sort of draws people into him like a magnet, and then he hurts them. And so having this very complicated character, Burr, be the person who ends up killing him, who just can't stand it anymore because Hamilton has hurt him too much, also creates a drama about the revolution that reminds you that it was about people as much as it was about ideas, as much as it was about politics and taxes and tea and everything like that. The American Revolution was about people who were brave and they were foolish and they were ambitious and they succeeded and they failed and they left us with this great, glorious, flawed country that we have now.
Well, that's fascinating. I very much enjoy listening to both of you talking about this. I haven't read extensively about Hamilton, but let me ask you a question that's very brief but very big in everybody's mind. How historically accurate is Hamilton?
Do you want to go first, Claire, this time, or should I go?
Sure, I'll go first. So one of the reasons we decided to write the book in the first place, or to put together the essays that make up the book, is that we knew that people were teaching Hamilton as history, particularly high school teachers, but we were also hearing from our peers in colleges that because Hamilton was so popular, they wanted to capture students' imaginations with it. And we thought this was great. And then we also thought this is concerning because in fact, there are things in the play that aren't historically accurate. And Renee will tell you a few things about that. But what we thought that all of these teachers needed was a book of essays, not to say this is right, this is wrong, because this is art. Okay, so certain things are going to be manipulated. Like John Adams isn't in the play at all. You would think there was no John Adams ever if you just watched Hamilton. But there's a reason John Adams can't be in the play, because you can't have too many characters in a musical, right? So we thought people needed this book to help them think through why Miranda had made the decisions he had made. And what about the play were intended to provoke the audience rather than inform the audience. And I actually think one really good example of that is the Schuyler sisters. Women in the American Revolution were often great readers. They contributed to the work of the revolution, but they didn't march around slumming in downtown New York all by themselves looking for guys, right? So that's a little feature of the play that does two things. One is it's hip and cool and fun, and you can actually have a musical nowadays that doesn't have great parts for women. But the other thing it does is it says, okay, women didn't get the vote after the American Revolution. They didn't get the vote for hundreds of years, but actually the ideas that were at the heart of the revolution were part of what eventually got women the vote, okay? And women knew that. So I think there are these historical inaccuracies that sometimes lead Hamilton to a bigger truth. They lead the audience to a bigger truth about history and about the period. Renee, why don't you pick it up?
Yeah, I'd agree with some of that. I would also say there's actual real historical inaccuracies in Hamilton that are in fact problematic, right? So the biggest ones, Hamilton downplays the importance, the place, the centrality of slavery in the early United States, right? In the colonies and in the early United States. There are essays in the book that complain that, in our book, that really critique Hamilton for ignoring essentially the actual history of people of color in the early Americas, while featuring actors of color playing historically white characters, right? But you would not know from Hamilton, as one of our contributors says, that this greatest city in the world, supposedly of New York, that 40% of the people who lived there at that time basically were enslaved, right? At the time of Hamilton, right? Hamilton his anti-slavery credentials are made more than they actually were. So when they sing in the musical, we're a bunch of revolutionary manumission abolitionists. Those words don't even go together, right? Abolition and manumission were two different political positions. Abolition was an immediate end to slavery. Manumission was, well, a gradual end over time, because there's, they were just very different political things. I think the biggest historical inaccuracy probably in Hamilton, besides its treatment of slavery or its lack of treatment, is it really makes Hamilton kind of the man of the people, right? He's the one we are associating with, where we see him as a man of the people, where Thomas Jefferson is an elitist. Hamilton was all for the centralization of state power. He was very, very, very suspicious of democracy. He did not trust the masses. He was relatively conservative in that way, right? He wanted to centralize state power. He wanted to reduce the ability of the people to have a say in, really, he thought, potentially taking the government off tracks. And he was very open to using military force to put down what he saw as challenges to government power. So that's not a story we get in Hamilton, really, or a picture we get of him. And those are problematic, I think, inaccuracies. On the other hand, and I think Claire's absolutely right, this is a piece of historical fiction. It is not a history textbook, and it can't be. And there's many ways in which Hamilton gets larger things right? Even just the way it's music, full of energy and drama, and using these vibrant forms of hip hop and rap and Latin music to tell the founding story really gets something right about the energy of the American Revolution, right? We get something right here about the nature of the politics. There's a lot that is compelling about the ways the story is told. So even having the King George character, who here is presented in the play as an effeminate kind of comedy, we laugh every time he comes on stage. He's played as very effeminate. But if you look at drawings from the American Revolution, right, one of the things that was happening was England and King George would be presented as effeminate in those drawings because that was a way to express power. Like gender became a way to express power. So in some ways, that's also expressing a larger historical truth about how the revolutionaries were depicting King George and the British during the American Revolution.
And Renee, I was just listening to you talking about the manumission abolitionists. I never thought about this before you said this, but that lyric actually in some ways expresses their confusion about what they're doing.
That's true.
That they don't actually know what this liberty, what this freedom is going to be. And they're sort of like grabbing ideas and mashing them together as if it makes sense. And of course, it doesn't really make sense to them. So that's just a little insight as to why those two things that don't go together might in fact have deliberately been put together.
They might have. I think probably the words rhyme too. And the other thing that folks talk about Hamilton is using this whole immigrant kind of framework, right? Hamilton is an immigrant. Is not really, that kind of framework didn't exist at this period, right? He is a citizen of a British colony traveling to another British colony, right? So the immigration framework we associate with the 19th century, right, is not really the best way to understand migration in this period. So, that's another way in which, is it inaccurate? It's a framing that historians of the period would not see as the most useful for understanding how migration was taking place in this period of American history.
Well, and it's interesting, Renee, too. I think the immigration part, while this was being written, it was during the Bush administration. And actually, George Bush was very pro-immigrant. And it's sort of one of the upheavals in the Republican Party that has happened since, that the pro-immigration part of the Republican Party has kind of gotten sidelined. So there was an immigration story to tell at that moment as the Bush administration was pushing forward a variety of reforms, and then the Obama administration continued to do that. What you then saw in the theater in New York once Mr. Trump was elected is that line, "Immigrants, we get things done," and there's a big high five, and the theater would just explode, in applause. And so I think one of the features of that immigrant thing, and Renee is absolutely right, she's saying about it, is that emphasis of immigration as this continuous thread through American history that in some ways connects all of us to one story. So
well, and I just one final thing, and I'll be quiet, but I think one of the things that Claire just gave a really nice entry into is the field of historical memory, which is the study of representations of the past and the political and cultural work they do in the present. When I see a movie or a play or a political speech that's about using history or about history, I'm often thinking about what does this tell us about our present day moment, right? Or what are they using the past to make arguments about in the present? So I think, that yes, the immigration storyline in Hamilton reflects in part contemporary concerns and Lin Manuel Miranda's own political commitments around immigration more than they tell us anything about 18th century.
Yeah.
Well, professors, how have historians engaged with Hamilton?
So I'll just take one stab and then you can go, Claire. I think people have been pretty eager to explore it. One of the things we discovered, neither Claire or I study early American history. We both are 20th century historians. I was interested in Hamilton because of an interest in historical memory, right? To see something that was so popular about early American history to say, what is it that is, leading people to jump on this bandwagon? That's why I wanted to engage with Hamilton. One of the things we discovered is that early American historians tend to be very committed to a particular, particular kinds of histories and accuracies and debates and fights with one another. I think it's a reasonably small field. So there were people who were really angry at this play, right? Really angry at what they saw as its historical inaccuracies. I think there were some historians who were jealous, frankly, right? Like, how is it that I write books and nobody's queuing up to buy them, right? What is he doing that's leading to this huge outpouring of fandom, of love for this representation of the American Revolution when I can't sell my books, right? So there's a bit of that too in some people. But I think a lot of people also really wanted to think about how and what we could learn from this in terms of both how to tell stories, what makes stories compelling, how we can portray history in complex ways in popular culture, and how we could think about what is revolutionary or not revolutionary about this particular portrayal with its casting and its musical choices.
Yeah, and I think the historians we've seen really engage with it have been the public historians, the museum people, the historians who engage on a regular basis with a large, undifferentiated audience. And they have really hit a bonanza with Hamilton, because once the musical became popular, there were all kinds of people who couldn't get tickets to the musical. But when they came to New York, they would go to see the Grange, which was Hamilton's home. They would roam around Wall Street and find all the addresses where Hamilton lived. They went to Trinity Church to see where he was buried. So there was a really big boom in Hamilton exhibits, Hamilton public history. And astonishingly for us, and it was really very exciting, people doing their own Hamilton research. So that one of the things that Miranda does with the play is it's full of research. And he talked a lot when he was in front of audiences talking about the play, about working in primary documents. He worked with the historian Joanne Freeman at Yale, who's an expert on dueling in early America and early American violence. And he worked very closely with her. So a lot of the audience sort of picked up on this and got by osmosis Miranda's enthusiasm for really doing history. And you see a lot of this online, people doing reports on Hamilton that they've researched at the New York Historical Society, and kids, doing Hamilton videos of themselves, and so on and so forth. So if in fact a lot of professional historians were unfriendly, to put it mildly, part of what we loved was that we saw all kinds of people loving history and working history into their lives and imagining this early American world. And it really sort of clued me into the fact that people love early American history. They love the origin story of when this all began. And, a lot of the things that we argue about today, and a lot of things that were, we just passed a $1.9 trillion bill in Congress that Thomas Jefferson would have slit his throat over. And that's in the play. Okay. I mean, that argument that they had over that bill in Congress was the argument that Hamilton and Jefferson were having, and they have it right on stage.
Claire, you should tell your Federalist Papers story.
Oh my God. So when Renee talked me into doing this book, I thought I should read the Federalist Papers again, because I hadn't read them since I was in high school. And I had a copy somewhere, it was all falling apart. So I went on Amazon.com to buy a new copy of the Federalist Papers, and it was sold out. And I realized there were all of these Hamilton fans who they would watch Hamilton, and there's this whole segment of the musical that's about the Federalist Papers, and they were like, I have to read the Federalist Papers. And this is one of the things that I just absolutely love about Americans. It's you tell them, the key to our country, to our entire country, and everything that went into making this government is in these Federalist Papers, and they say, okay, I need to read them now. And they did. I had to search all over New England to get a copy of the Federalist Papers so we could actually do this project.
That is very exciting, because I run into a lot of Americans who really have lost interest in American history. So that's great news. Now, can you speak to what makes Hamilton a revolutionary play?
Well, okay, so this is one of the debates in the book, right? Hamilton has declared itself a revolution, and many people have seen it as such. So if you have seen the huge book that Lin Manuel Miranda wrote with Jeremy McWhorter, it's called Hamilton, the Revolution, right? Not exactly humble. And it claims itself to be revolutionary. So that's one of the questions that we gathered essays to explore. Is this revolutionary? If not, what's new about Hamilton? What's not new? And I think, everything has a history, historians like to say. It's very hard to imagine something that's truly unprecedented. I think what makes Hamilton really powerful, right, is the way it is doing its casting and using the music of rap music and hip hop and Latino music, among many other genres, right? Those are not the only genres in the musical, to tell the story of America's founding, and featuring these characters who are these wonderful actors of color playing George Washington and Angelica Schuyler and all these folks, right? Now, of course, he's not the first person to do this kind of casting, that is casting people in not in a racially mixed, racially different than their roles were originally intended to be. In fact, it often goes the other way, right? White actors being cast to play like Asian parts. But I think that's probably what people feel is most revolutionary about it. The actual storytelling, the actual sort of history we get here of early America is pretty traditional, right? It's pretty traditional within our narratives that we tell ourselves in founding father literature. It's not much of a departure. It's comfortable history, right? This is a type of story that we're familiar with, and that also stems from and relates to and draws on other musicals that were about politics, right? There's a whole genre of musicals about politics from 1776, about the founding, to all kinds of things. And you see in the show, Lin Manuel Miranda constantly referencing other musicals. Like, this is also a love letter to musicals. Like Hamilton, Lin Manuel Miranda loves Broadway, right? So we get references to Gilbert and Sullivan, we get references to Cole Porter, we get references to all this musical history that puts Hamilton sort of in a tradition, rather than saying it is completely overthrowing that tradition.
Yeah, and to pick it up from there, I think one of the things we have learned is that Hamilton, because it has been so successful, has become this pipeline for actors of color. Renee and I have done some events with a couple of young people who are in the touring company of Hamilton. And one of the things they talk about is the excitement among young actors of color that there's this big opening. And I think, it really changed some things. Before COVID shut Broadway down, there was a new production of Oklahoma with an entirely Black cast, in which one of the love interests was disabled and in a wheelchair, and so on. So Hamilton has made certain kinds of projects fundable that were never fundable before. And I think one of the things that's interesting about Oklahoma, I know the woman who runs the Rodgers and Hammerstein Foundation, which has to give permission for every single production, whether it's a high school production or a Broadway production. You have to tell them how you're going to do it, and they say whether you can do it or not. And before Hamilton, I can't imagine that they would have licensed a production that was entirely Black with disabled characters in it. That is just not something this very conservative foundation would have done. And so Hamilton kind of opened the door to say, you can take old musicals and refresh them and make them different and attractive to the audiences that exist now. I think the other thing that Hamilton did is, because it made gobs and gobs and gobs of money, it supported a lot of other enterprises. So the theater bookstore, for example, which is right in the middle of Times Square, was going bankrupt. Lin Manuel Miranda bought it because he said this theater bookstore should always exist. But the other thing is that there's a kind of profits tax on Broadway to spread money around from the more successful musicals so that new productions can go up. And so one of the things that Hamilton did was it really propped up Broadway at a difficult time, right? Because Broadway was just recovering from the recession when Hamilton went up. And so it pumped money into art, into theater, into music. Hamilton also became a place for public school children to go. Miranda and the Gilder Lehrman Society teamed up to put together a syllabus for public schools and to bring kids from all over New York to see the show and to participate in making their own theater and their own dance and their own performances. And in all of the satellite cities where Hamilton has gone, they've had that same public school program. So it's revolutionary in a way that people sometimes don't talk about, which is Miranda has made a commitment to the communities that he's in to spread it beyond the wealthy, mostly white audience that gets to go to the theater.
Yeah.
Now, the two of you edited this book, but you both also prepared material for the book. So I want to ask each of you a specific question about one of your sections. Claire, how has social media affected Hamilton?
Oh my gosh, that's such a great question. So one of the things I wrote about for the book is that there's a big gap between Miranda's first hit, which is In the Heights, and Hamilton, 9 years. That's a really long time to keep your audience. And one of the things Miranda did was he established a really, really active social media presence very early on, right? And so what he did is he invited his audience into the making of the show. He used a lot of Vimeo. That was one of his first platforms. He also used Vine, which is now gone. He used Twitter. And he would gather these fans together on these platforms to think through the various problems he was working on with the show. And he also was very original. I mean, you know, part of what we see about the most successful social media influencers is that they're authentic, they're genuine, they don't have people running their accounts for them. And you can see Lin on all these accounts. So that by the time Hamilton takes off, there is this huge audience of kids, you know, and young people really aren't into Broadway musicals. But he has this huge audience of kids that's waiting for the show. Well, what are you going to do with these kids? Because they're not going to get to go to the show. And a lot of these kids are in places like Lawrence, Kansas. Okay, they're really not going to get to go to the show. So what he does is he puts the cast album up for free. You can listen to it digitally for free. And people start listening to it. And then it's like, oh my God, Mom and Dad, I have to have this. And they start, and because actually the whole story is told in the music, they can imagine what the show will be like. What Miranda then does is he creates what I call the digital backstage, so that there are all of these performances. They're sort of, you know, very spontaneous performances backstage in which he broadcasts getting ready for the show. And the actors goofing around together and getting into their costumes. So like there are videos where you can see Lin-Manuel transforming himself into Alexander Hamilton as he's talking to his fans live. What's cool about this is content that the people who are wealthy enough to sit in those seats in the theater can't access. So all of these kids in Lawrence, Kansas, and Los Angeles, California, and Philadelphia, and Tampa, Florida, have a kind of special channel to Lin Manuel Miranda that nobody else does. And so that's a big part of the popularity of the play, is his connection to them and his invitation to them to become part of his creative world. And that's what social media made possible for him.
Renee, my question for you tonight, how does Hamilton interact with political constructions of history?
Right. So I was really, in my essay, wanted to look at and was really interested in the fact that Hamilton is a story about politics, and it's a story about early American politics. And typically that's really divisive, right? There's long been history wars in this country about how we should teach our past, narrate our past, what our history is. Do we emphasize the dark aspects of American history? Do we emphasize slavery and native dispossessions? Do we tell our history as a celebratory story of freedom and liberty, right? And Hamilton, amazingly, despite being a story about politics, was something that got support and fans from both sides of the political aisle. And this really struck me, particularly in an age when we've seen such intense political polarization, as something that needed to be explored and explained. So, Barack Obama says at one point that Hamilton is the only thing that he and Dick Cheney ever agreed upon. Hamilton gets positive reviews in both the very left-leaning Nation and the quite right-leaning National Review. In Utah, my very favorite story, the very conservative member of the state legislature got together with one of the most progressive members of the state legislature, and they dressed up as King George and Alexander Hamilton to sponsor a resolution asking teachers in Utah to use and teach this play whenever it was appropriate to do so. So it's a really interesting thing to think about. What representation of politics is one that brings together far-right Republicans and far-left Democrats, right? What is he doing that allows him to bridge what has been a really divisive political divide in the United States? And ultimately, where I think Hamilton is doing really important political work and cultural work is by offering us an origin story that is broadened to include a diverse America, but doesn't make white Americans feel excluded. And I think that's a really hard thing to do. I mean, we have origin stories that really celebrate sort of our white founding fathers and ignore the fact that they owned slaves, right? We have folks arguing we need to talk about the centrality of slavery and the 1619 Project and other ways of approaching American history. And what Hamilton is doing and what Lin Manuel Miranda is doing, I think, is in part really giving ownership and saying we are all equal in this nation. We all have the same right, the same capacity to tell its story, but we're going to make people feel comfortable by telling a relatively familiar and traditional story. So it's broadening our civic base, broadening the circle of who belongs, who feels fully and can feel fully American, for whom is this country, who gets to tell its story without being exclusionary to anyone. And I think that's a really powerful political intervention. Then and now remains a really important political conversation as we become a more diverse country and really grapple with what that means for our future and how politically we navigate becoming a more diverse nation.
I have a couple more questions, but we're going to open up for audience questions and answers in just a few minutes. So I would encourage everyone, if you have a question, send it to dolequestions@ku.edu. We'll get to as many of them as we possibly can tonight. I have a couple final questions, professors. First, how does a play succeed or fail at addressing the historical legacy of patriarchy in American politics?
Oh, such a good question. I think one of the central themes of Hamilton is masculinity, because one of Hamilton's great flaws is he's vain, and he needs to win. He doesn't need to just compete. He always needs to win, and so part of the clash between Hamilton and Burr is that they both need to win. And Burr can't figure out why Hamilton always wins. But there's this beautiful song at the middle of the play in which Hamilton and Burr are singing to their children. They both have babies, and Burr's baby is a daughter who was born to a British woman he was having an affair with, who goes back to England. So he's left with custody of his daughter. Hamilton has a son, and they're talking about their dreams for their new nation. And Burr, again, and I've told you I'm a Burr fan, he sings a song called Dear Theodosia, in which he is talking about his hopes and his dreams for a girl. And that actually injects a note that is not false. You know, part of the Enlightenment vision that the American Revolution was born out of was the idea that women were intelligent too. Women had ideas too. And even though you see the word man being used in all of the founding documents, a sort of universal man, part of what the Enlightenment opened people up to is the idea that anyone could have a mind and anyone could have ideas. And so you have these really strong female characters in the play who really sort of move the action. And Hamilton's wife, Eliza, for example, we know early on that she will be the person who is in charge of Hamilton's history. Hamilton may be in charge of his life. He may be in charge of running the country, but it is she who will end up telling his story. And so I think the play offers a more hopeful vision about patriarchy than we often read about in that period. And also, you know, brings out, again, a central truth. Abigail Adams, for example, made John Adams' political career possible because she was so good with money. And she speculated in Western lands. And Abigail Adams was in charge of their entire fortune while John Adams was off doing politics. That's not a story that's often told, but Miranda sort of brings out that idea that's very true, that women were doing all kinds of intellectual and political and economic work in this new nation that made us what we are today.
Yeah, I'll just add one sentence there, which is that the play gives a little bit of taste of the limitations on women, right? We know from Angelica Schuyler, right, I need to marry for money, and the kind of ways in which women are limited. But one of the essays in the book looks at coverture, which is the entire system of laws that essentially made women second-class citizens, right? So you might manage property, but women couldn't, you know, own property in the same way as men. They didn't have the same rights as men. And so I think the play gives a hint of that, but that's something where you know, there's a lot more that could be dug deeper, and not necessarily in this play, but I think there's a really rich history there that we really should all learn more about.
Well, and if I can just jump on that, I was actually thinking about the song that leads off the second act, which is actually one of my favorite songs, Thomas Jefferson's "What Did I Miss?" And there we see another kind of patriarchy, which is the patriarchy of the slave owners. Right. Mm-hmm. And so the whole preamble to that song is the chorus, who are playing enslaved people, saying, Mr. Jefferson's coming home, Mr. Jefferson's coming home. Well, if you know the history of that, one of the things you know is that one of the chief anxieties, if you were enslaved, was that you would be sold away from your family and friends. And so when the master went away, this fear that he actually wouldn't return, and that you would be left adrift and sold by the people who inherited you, was a terrible, terrible fear. So that's another kind of patriarchy that is injected in the play. Their relief and joy that he is home is a relief and joy that their world will not be unsettled this time.
I have one final question tonight, professors, and then we're going to open it up for our audience. And I have to ask this, is Hamilton art or history?
Oh, can't you be both? I don't know that I buy that distinction. It's clearly art, right? But I do think it is also doing historical work, right? I don't know. It depends how hard we keep the gates. Do we want to say only professional historians get to do history? I think history is a broad, welcoming field that lots of people practice history. And there's histories of different qualities. There's histories, you know, and there are problems with this history. But I do think it is a historical representation that counts as historical fiction, right? Which is history that is also using fictional elements and telling powerful, compelling stories. So I guess I would reject the dichotomy between those two.
Well, and I would actually go even a little further to say that art can sometimes do something that history doesn't always do, which is tell you what it felt like to live in that moment. And I'm thinking about a novelist like Zola, for example. I mean, Zola's first novel is about, well, it's set in the time of Haussmann. So Haussmann, the city planner, is basically ripping Paris apart and rebuilding it in another way entirely to be a modern city. And so there's the whole plot of the novel, but then it's surrounded by this city that is actually being torn down and rebuilt, and people talking about what that feels like. What does it feel like to have the city you know disappear to be replaced by, you know, the emperor's folly? And so I think art can sometimes tell us how people felt living in a particular period. So, you know, certainly Jane Austen does that for England. James Fenimore Cooper does that for the United States. So I think art has that role of opening us up to what our ancestors experienced, as opposed to the facts of what they knew.
Our first question from our audience tonight is from Mary Beth, and Mary Beth asks, what do you consider the best book to best understand and appreciate Eliza?
Oh,
That's a good question.
The best book to understand and appreciate Eliza. Boy, gosh, I'm thinking Women of the Republic. I don't know. What would you say, Linda Kerber?
I would absolutely say Linda Kerber. Yeah, Linda Kerber is really the historian who created the idea of women's intellectual history for the early American Republic. Mm-hmm. But I would also, this doesn't help you understand Eliza, but it helps you understand her world. A woman named Mia Bay has written a book about Black intellectual history and how the women's ideas during this period. Martha Jones has also written about, how Black women experienced early America and how they got their ideas out there. But I would say Linda Kerber is really probably the best one for understanding Eliza. But I would also say, take a look at, if you can get your hands on it, the first biography of Hamilton, which was written by Hamilton's son, I think it was James who wrote it. And it was the book that Eliza badgered him until he wrote, basically. She badgered him for 10 or 15 years until he sat down and wrote the biography of his father. And that kind of a book gives you some insight into how she thought about her husband. I mean, it's a history book, only not in the contemporary sense. It's something we call hagiography, which is it was a book that was written to honor Hamilton. But there are parts in it that are actually about her that she must have practically dictated to her son and had him write them down. So if you read that book, you would also get a sense of Eliza's voice in a way that would not be apparent just from a book of intellectual history.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, our next question is from Rebecca. Please expand on why you feel Aaron Burr is so interesting.
Okay,
Claire, you're the one who really loves Aaron Burr. Though I like Aaron Burr too.
I adore Aaron Burr. So
you adore Aaron Burr.
Yeah, so I have been a Burrite since I was a child. One of the things that fascinated me about Burr, my father, in addition to taking me to historic sites, would give me, history books that were written for kids. And one of them was about Hamilton and Burr. And I guess I read it when I was 9 or 10 years old. And part of what I was just drawn by is, what is it like to be such an ambitious person and he was vice president of the United States when he killed Hamilton, right? He's on his way up in the world, and then he does something that is so terrible that it ruins him forever. So I think, partly I'm interested in Burr as a tragic figure, but Burr is also, in many ways, he anticipates the modern world more than Hamilton does. So for example, Burr is the first person to campaign for office, right? Before Burr, and this is actually in the play, before Burr, it was considered ungentlemanly and impolite to ask people for their vote. And so Burr is the first person when he's running for, he's running for Senate, I guess, first, before he becomes a candidate for vice president. He goes around asking people to vote for him and asking people to endorse him and so on, and just sort of laying it all out there. And people are appalled because they think, this is wrong, this is ugly, this is ungentlemanly. Look at how divisive politics could become if people did this. And of course, what Burr is anticipating is the emergence of party politics, the emergence of a modern campaign. But he also is illustrating an investment in politics, I guess, that I'm more sympathetic to than I am to Hamilton's investment in himself. All right, so Hamilton built all these structures, but it was all about realizing his own ideas about what government should look like. Whereas Burr was sort of reckless, but he also cared about politics for the sake of politics. It excited him. And so I'm more like Burr. I get involved in political campaigns. I cry when my candidate loses, and so I think Burr is really anticipating that modern world of politics that will be realized actually in the Jacksonian era, and that will lay the foundation for our own contemporary political world. So I see Burr as more of a modern man, actually, than Hamilton.
Okay, our next question is from a member of our student advisory board. Olivia asks, in your opinion, what is the most important message that Miranda wants young people to take from the musical?
That's a great question. So I think he wants young people to take from the musical that they can make themselves, that we have the capacity to really use our words and our skills and our own abilities to make our way through the world, right? That you can be ambitious, that you can make things happen, that's one big message. I think another big message is that it's important to be invested and to debate and to be engaged and to be part of and pay attention to the world in which you are living, right? So Hamilton is somebody who comes and who is seeking to make his mark on history, but also seeking to really engage with the world around him. And I think that's really important, particularly for young people who may spend a lot of time on their cell phones, right? To think about, put it down and actually look at the world around you and become engaged, right? Become involved in the debates and the fights, become involved, make your mark. And I think that's part of really what he's trying to communicate to young folks, is that you have power, right? You have power to shape the course of history. We all have power to shape the course of history. So pick up that power and use it and really try to make something of your time here.
Okay.
I would agree with that. I just wanted to throw one thing in. I would agree with what Renee is saying. It's also one of the criticisms of the play
Right.
of some people on the left. They say, why are we pushing this entrepreneurship thing? Why are we pushing the money-making thing? Really, when you're celebrating Alexander Hamilton, you're celebrating capitalism. And I'm just putting it out there. This is one of the critiques. I think one of the things that's interesting about it is that entrepreneurship is a really big deal in communities of color around New York. So Lin Manuel Miranda grew up as a very middle-class person. His mother's involved with Planned Parenthood, and his father, I think, was a politician of some kind.
Political operative.
But political operative. But Miranda knew a lot of kids who wanted to start a business, right? So there actually is something in the play that I think speaks to a great many young people's ambitions, that they want to be independent, they want to be free. And what Miranda is saying is, as Renee points out, is you can do it. Study hard, read as much as you can, stay up all night if you have to get a project done. You know, one of the things I think about every time that we have a place in Massachusetts and also a place in New York, but every time I am driving that last stretch down the Hudson River, I think about Alexander Hamilton going from Manhattan to his wife's family farm in upstate New York. And he would take a boat up the Hudson River. And that's when he did a lot of his writing, was on that, right? So I think, Olivia, another thing that Miranda is really saying is that each of us needs to find our best self and realize it.
I've got time for another question or two. If anybody in the audience would like to submit it by email to dolequestions@ku.edu. Jenny asked, if John Adams were a character in Hamilton, what would his character look like?
Well, he was, and they cut him.
Yeah, they did. They cut him. They had a whole song about John Adams and decided it was too long and it took it in too many directions. I think Paul Giamatti, if you saw the John Adams miniseries, was a great John Adams. Like, I think he looked like Paul Giamatti, except maybe, like he'd have to be a character color. So I don't know. I mean, Tyler Perry. I don't know. I think like the way Hamilton feels about John Adams, he might be represented as a Tyler Perry type character.
But nobody liked John Adams, right? And so John Adams, he was crude, he was boring, he had a terrible temper. You know, he couldn't get reelected because people liked him so little. But I also think that if John Adams were in the play, I actually think he would be another foil for Hamilton. And I think what makes the play work is that Jefferson and Burr are these two very different foils. If you added another foil, it would actually be pretty complicated. But Adams would have to be a foil. He would be the one who was always saying, you know, that's not practical. You know, we have to get a quorum. Where's the quorum? You know, he would be the one who was always laying down the rules for everyone else.
Yeah. I just want to add one other thing that I think was really interesting when we've been doing these events with actors in the show. And one of the writers in our book, who's a theater historian, was constantly reminding us whenever we did events with him, like a play is different for every performance, right? So we, you know, often think about like a singular event, or now we've got the Disney streaming version of Hamilton and that is Hamilton, but it's different for every performance. And one of the actors who we were talking with at an event last week even was saying that when he first joined the show, he's now playing Alexander Hamilton, but he was the standby to play all of the lead men. So he sang the song My Shot for us, and he did every single part. So he played John Lawrence, he played Hercules Mulligan, he played Alexander Hamilton, he played Aaron Burr, he played everybody. And I think like that's one of the things that we that can be lost in talking about historians talking about theater, is how it can change with every single performance. And so when we ask like, what would somebody look like? I mean, that's a little bit of a, you know, like I'm taking it a little tongue in cheek, right? But it would be different every performance probably because the actors rotate in and out of these roles, because that's the way theater works.
Okay, we have time for one final question tonight. Zach asks, this is a tough one. What is your favorite part of the musical and why?
Oh, so my favorite part is the saddest part. My favorite part is the song "It's Quiet Uptown," And when we have basically Alexander and Eliza grieving for the death of their son in a duel, and it's a song about grief, about losing a child, and then ultimately about forgiveness. And what that really connects to me with is just the raw emotion of it, and the way, what I love about history is that it's telling people stories, right? It's about the human scale. And there's a lot in this play about politics. There's a lot about race. There's a lot about early America, but there we just get a couple that is grieving and trying to find their way forward. And I love the fact that the play can operate on all those different levels, the political level and this very personal level. And to me, that moment really connects, as I can understand and feel those emotions and really empathize with those characters in that moment.
It's a really tough question, Zach. And I was sort of going back and forth between King George's first solo, which I think is hilarious, but it also really expresses the actual relationship between the colonies and England. But I think because I'm a New Yorker, my favorite song is the one where the British attack, the one that begins, General Howe's got troops on the water, 30,000 troops in New York Harbor. We're surrounded, we're surrounded, we're surrounded. And that sense of New York as an island, where this enormous battle is about to be fought, and the Continental Army is completely ill-equipped to fight it. And Washington's despair that he doesn't even have a professional army to command to make a stand in New York City. That's really my favorite song, because it's one of the lowest points of the American Revolution. It's the moment when the world thinks, these people are finished, and the British are going to take back their colony, and the world will get back on its axis, and it doesn't. So I love that, because it's a kind of turning point where disaster opens the door to the possibility for success, for making this work. At the end of the song, Hamilton is saying, we can't fight the war the way you want to fight it. We have to do it this way. We have to, here's another idea. Here's another idea. We have to get behind trees. We have to hide. We have to wait until we see the whites of their eyes. And what you actually see in that song is a revolution in what it means to fight a war. And I think that song expresses it beautifully, but also it's about every single part of Manhattan that I love.
Claire, a terrific evening. I want to thank you both for visiting the Dole Institute virtually, putting in a fascinating evening together for us. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
I want to thank all of our audience for I want to thank all of our audience for joining. Really appreciate it. I want to encourage you to join us for a discussion of the PBS document Represented, which will be Tuesday night at 7 p.m. We will be our instructions and adding to our website instructions on how you can important document to see you then. Thank you much for joining. We'll see you.
Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for our program this evening. If you're a student and would like to join the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Next week, we look forward to hosting Andrew Rodney, Greg Orman, and Mary Banwart on Tuesday, March 16th at 7 p.m. for a panel discussion of their new PBS documentary, Unrepresented. You can access this program on the Dole Institute's YouTube channel, just like tonight's program. Refer to doleinstitute.org for up-to-date information on all of our upcoming programs. We hope you enjoyed this evening's program. Thank you and good night.